Greeting you through the static of the airwaves. From the Great Plains, my name is Chance, and you're tuned in to The Mystery Report. On today's episode, we will be discussing one of the most chilling missing persons cases of the 21st century. One that, due to the nature of the details, seems to straddle the line between the realms of true crime and the paranormal. I am referring to the disappearance and eventual discovery of the death of Joshua Maddux. This is a case that has gripped me and tested the limits of my mind ever since I first heard the bizarre details. I am not sure I have a solid hypothesis to explain the events I am about to unfold to you. As you will no doubt discover, there are aspects of this case that simply do not add up. And without further delay, let us dive right in. Joshua Maddux was born in 1990 in the sleepy town of Woodland Park, Colorado. Set amidst the Rocky Mountains, it is located in Teller County, which is subsequently located in Pike National Forest. Woodland Park is not necessarily extremely remote, being only about half an hour from Colorado Springs, but as viewed from the summit of Pikes Peak, this quiet town of less than 8,000 people certainly radiates an air of wilderness, being surrounded by a gorgeous sea of trees. Josh lived in Woodland Park with his father Mike and two sisters Ruth and Kate. He was described as being a carefree soul who loved the outdoors. He excelled in school, and classmates noted his atmosphere of subtle intellect and charisma. Apparently perceived as somewhat eccentric, he was observed to have worn a top hat and brought a briefcase to school instead of a backpack. By all accounts, he was well known and well liked by his peers. In his spare time, he was known to play guitar and write music. He was also an avid hiker and general enjoyer of nature, frequently taking walks through the woods surrounding his home. In 2008, Josh celebrated his 18th birthday. By this time, his blonde hair had grown quite long, and he stood 6 feet tall, weighing in at around 150 pounds. In addition to Kate and Ruth, Josh also had an older brother. His name was Zachary, and the two were extremely close, with Josh looking up to him. But sadly, in 2006, Zachary would take his own life due to depression. According to his father, Josh was deeply affected at the time of Zachary's death. However, by 2008, it was said that Josh had recovered from his grief and was doing very well emotionally. Because of this, there was no second thought by his sister Kate when on May 8, 2008, he told her he was going for a walk. He had done this countless times, and for him to traverse the forests around their home on his own was nothing out of the ordinary. He was in good spirits, had no known enemies, exhibited no evidence of using perception-altering substances, and gave no indication that he was suicidal or otherwise given to self-harm. But despite all these facts, for some reason Joshua Maddux would never return home from his walk. That evening, having heard nothing from Josh, his family became concerned. For several days, they held out hope that he would return, and given his carefree nature, it seems like it would not have been unreasonable for them to have assumed he was with a friend or staying elsewhere. However, they contacted everyone he knew, and each person gave the same reply. They had no knowledge of his whereabouts. By May 13th, Mike Maddux had reported his son as missing to the police. A search was initiated involving Josh's family, friends, and local authorities. But the days turned to weeks, then to months, and no clues as to his location were discovered. Eventually, hopes faded, and efforts to find him were called off. There was no reason for the authorities to believe that foul play had been involved, as no evidence had been found that pointed to that conclusion. Because of this, Joshua Maddux was merely listed as a standard missing person, and authorities pursued no further investigations into his fate. This consensus was seemingly shared by his family, and at the time of his disappearance, Kate Maddux voiced her theory that Josh had simply left town to start a new life, being a fresh-faced 18-year-old ready to explore the world. Her hope was that eventually he would return with a family of his own, or perhaps become a successful musician. These thoughts perhaps gave comfort to the family, as they were forced to reconcile with the fact that they had lost not one, but two members of their household within only a couple of years. This would be the only sort of resolution the family could gain for the next 7 years. But in 2015, a cabin only a couple blocks away from their home would yield a startling answer and some disturbing finality to the question, where is Josh Maddux? This cabin was owned by a man around 80 years old named Chuck Murphy, whose family had obtained it as well as the somewhat expansive property it sat on in the 1950s. This domicile would be used by the Murphy family over the years varyingly as a rental property or residence. The last occupant, Chuck's brother, would vacate the cabin sometime in 2005, after which the building would be used solely for storage, with Chuck stating that the family would visit and check on it only irregularly. About a decade later, Chuck would make the decision to demolish the derelict cabin in order to help accommodate a housing development that would be built on his land. The demolition began routinely and continued for a while, during which time anything made of metal would be collected and sent away to scrap. But things took a decidedly macabre turn as the demolition team began to tear into one of the 2 chimneys in the cabin. Crammed inside this narrow brick structure was a mummified corpse. Witnesses noted that the body was in the fetal position, with its legs above its head. It was also mentioned that one of the hands was resting in front of the face, perhaps to shield it from something. Immediately, the authorities were contacted, and investigations into the identity of the body were launched. Through the use of dental records, it was determined that the body in the chimney was in fact Joshua Maddux. The coroner for Teller County, Al Bourne, would be the individual tasked with determining the cause of death. In his evaluation, he noted that there was no sign of any obvious physical trauma that would have killed Josh Maddux. No stab wounds, gunshot wounds, broken bones, or anything. The only physical variance of the body was that the legs were disjointed from the torso, and it was observed that this seemed to be the only way that the body would have been able to fit in the chimney in that position. With no physical explanation as to the cause of death, Bourne made the determination that the boy had succumbed to either hypothermia or dehydration. In studying many cases of strange deaths, I have observed that when the cause is listed as exposure, it usually means either of these eventualities. Although Al Bourne himself did say that there would have been no way for them to tell whether hypothermia or dehydration set in first, and these things are often postulated when there are no obvious physical signs as to why a person perished. It was noted that temperatures in the nights following Josh's disappearance would have reached lows around 20 degrees Fahrenheit, which seems to support hypothermia. And of course, the human body cannot sustain itself very long without water, and being trapped in such a position would also make dehydration plausible. In any event, Bourne's conclusion was accidental death, his thought being that Josh simply entered the chimney of his own accord and became trapped. This theory was immediately called into question by many parties, not the least of which being the cabin owner himself, Chuck Murphy. The primary source of doubt from Murphy was the fact that the chimneys had been previously fitted with heavy-duty metal grates in order to prevent animals or other debris from entering the structure. Bourne's retort to this was the fact that no such metal grates had been captured in any photographs of the scene, and none were collected by investigators. He figured that any grate present had long been rusted away. But Murphy was adamant that the grate had been intact at the time of Joshua's disappearance, and in explaining the absence of the grate, his justification was this. As previously mentioned, all metal from the cabin had already been collected during the early stages of the demolition and sent away as scrap. But to the issue of the grate guarding the outside entrance to the chimney, it does feel as though both scenarios are plausible. Either it was there and would have prevented Josh from entering that way, or it had long eroded and was absent or weak enough to simply remove in the moment. Regardless, that is not the only piece of the puzzle. It had been noted that Joshua was found wearing only a thin t-shirt. He was naked from the waist down. This in itself is odd, but what absolutely baffled everyone was the fact that his remaining articles of clothing were found inside the cabin, placed neatly with his boots by the fireplace. The state of Josh's undress has been explained by some to have been caused by a phenomenon referred to as paradoxical undressing. Paradoxical undressing is a theory given by many that claims that when a person is extremely hypothermic, they will begin to shed clothing. It is not definitively known why victims of hypothermia do this, and theories range from confusion and disorientation to damage of certain nerves in the body from the cold. Another startling phenomenon related to extreme cases of hypothermia is that of terminal burrowing. Essentially, when individuals are extremely hypothermic and close to death, they will attempt to place themselves in small enclosed spaces. In some cases, hypothermia victims will be found deceased in small spaces, such as cupboards or dressers, either partly or completely undressed. Now, for those familiar with these purported aspects of hypothermia, it does not seem out of the question that someone suffering from extreme hypothermia would paradoxically undress themselves and terminally burrow into a chimney. But I will reiterate that the cabin in which Josh's remains were found was less than a mile away from his home, in an area that he was intimately familiar with. If he was indeed in any duress or cold enough to have succumbed to hypothermia, why would he not have simply returned home? I find that entire aspect of this case to be baffling. Another chilling discovery by Murphy was that of a bar top that had previously been attached to one of the walls inside the cabin. What would essentially be described as something of a counter, this rather large object had been ripped from the wall, then dragged and placed in front of the entrance of the fireplace as if to barricade it. It should be noted that there was no evidence of any sort of drugs in Josh's system, so the idea that he was perhaps under the influence of any sort of perception-altering substances which would have caused him to do such irrational things also does not seem plausible. Murphy also claimed that the cabin had indeed been locked as it normally should have been when demolition had begun. What all this means is that in order to fall in with the theory that Josh had ended up in that position due to his own actions, one has to believe that he somehow initially gained access to the cabin with no issue, stripped most of his clothes off, tore the bar counter away from the wall, placed it in front of the chimney, then left the cabin, locked himself out, and proceeded to attempt re-entry through the chimney. It does not seem like this is the behavior of anyone in a rational state of mind, and to me it seems imperceptible that this young man allowed himself to become so hypothermic as to lose his faculties without simply returning home. Because of the overwhelming sentiment by many that Josh had not gotten himself into that chimney, Al Bourne reopened his investigation only a few days after his initial determination of accidental death. Bourne even seemed to somewhat step on his own words at one point, as I discovered an article where he claimed that he felt as though it would have taken at least 2 people to place Josh into the chimney in his bizarre position. But despite all this, after further investigation, Bourne still ruled it as an accidental death, and to this day that is still the official explanation. Now, sometime around 2015, a user commented on a post in the subreddit r/AskReddit, in which the original poster was asking for stories from individuals claiming to have personally known serial killers. The commenter went on to claim that they were friends with Josh Maddux around the time he disappeared, and that they both went to high school with a kid named Andy, who Josh eventually began hanging out with. They would state that Andy was the last person Josh was seen with. This Andy was supposedly a man by the name of Andrew Richard Newman. Newman was a grifter who made himself somewhat known by purportedly stabbing a disabled man in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and when he was arrested for this, he also claimed to have killed a woman in the city of Taos, New Mexico, and stuffed her body in a barrel. Shockingly, it would later be discovered that a woman in Taos had indeed been murdered and found stuffed in a barrel, but authorities already had a suspect in custody for that crime and evidence supporting their arrest, so Newman was never made a suspect in that case. The commenter claimed that during the investigation after Josh's body had been found, themselves and a couple other friends had gone to the police to implicate Newman as Josh's killer, but that the authorities never followed up with the lead. There are many folks who believe that Newman was involved in Josh's death, but there are a few discrepancies that leave me with doubts. For starters, it was mentioned earlier that in the days immediately after Josh disappeared, his family had contacted all of his friends and were inquiring if anyone knew his whereabouts. They would state that these efforts yielded no information, as everyone they spoke to claimed not to have seen him. Even if the family did not directly contact this Reddit commenter, one would think that if they had pertinent information at the time of his disappearance, i.e. that he was last seen with Newman, they would have approached the family themselves to inform them. And in all the articles I read, the family never mentioned Andrew Newman. Not only that, but I could not find any news articles from the time Josh disappeared in 2008 that mentioned Andrew Newman, let alone him being a suspect. If this Reddit commenter had information at the time of Josh's disappearance, why wasn't it given to the family, the media, or even the police in 2008 instead of in 2015 after the body was found? To me, it seems like a glaring inconsistency that Andrew Newman was never mentioned until 2015, despite the fact that the Reddit commenter claimed to have known that Newman was with Josh at the time of his disappearance. If this weren't enough, I did some extensive gumshoeing attempting to find any indication that Newman was ever affiliated with Josh, or indeed with Woodland Park, Colorado. The only thing tying Newman to Colorado that I could even find was an article relaying information on an incident in a Brazos County jail which Newman was apparently involved in. The article simply mentioned him having been from Colorado, with nothing being said about Woodland Park. And I'll leave it up to you to decide how much weight this small connection has in the grand scheme of this case. It does beg mentioning that I did find one article from 2015 that includes some comments from Al Bourne about a suspect. And although he never directly names Newman, he mentions that the suspect had been rumored to have killed Josh and was in trouble in New Mexico. However, Bourne states that there was no evidence connecting that suspect to the case, or indeed placing him in the area whatsoever. Bourne essentially chalked the tips up to hearsay. He did also mention that in order for the death to even be definitively thought of as a homicide, physical evidence such as ropes or duct tape would have been present. And even if such evidence was perhaps removed from the scene, one would assume there would have been marks or other physical evidence on the body suggesting it was bound, but as previously mentioned, there were no signs of any physical trauma of that nature. Interestingly, Bourne also notes that there was no disruption of the soot inside the chimney, such as visible footprints, which would have shown how the body was placed inside. I find this odd because there would have obviously been no fires in the chimney after Josh's body was placed there that could have deposited fresh soot over previously disturbed soot, leading to the theory that the soot was never disturbed in the first place. There has never been any mention of any physical evidence found at all which would have pointed to a homicide. But in spite of all this, I feel like the fact that Bourne mentioned there was no evidence placing the suspect in Woodland Park at the time of Josh's disappearance is important in itself, because to me that means that the suspect was not someone who was a resident there, let alone someone who went to high school with the victim as was claimed. I am not setting out to call anyone a liar, but given the lack of any sort of connection to this case, I feel as though Newman had nothing to do with it. I cannot believe that he went to high school with Josh, and I doubt that if the Reddit commenter was actually a resident of Woodland Park and a friend of Josh Maddux when he disappeared, that they wouldn't have gone to the family, media, or authorities with their supposed information when Josh disappeared. And the reason I state that I don't believe Andrew Newman went to high school with Josh, or at least was not friends with him at the time of his disappearance, is because Newman was reportedly born in 1988, making him 2 years older than Josh, so I believe he most likely would have already graduated and have left town before Josh disappeared. Plus, if Newman was a classmate of Josh, one can assume the report would have mentioned that the suspect was a resident of the town or a high school student. In any case, unless some evidence comes out such as a yearbook or other document proving Newman went to high school with Josh, I feel like the claim by the Reddit commenter of a connection is tenuous at best. I personally spent hours scouring the internet trying to come up with any documentation that would have proven this connection, and came up empty-handed. After all of this, I have to reiterate that this case is one that absolutely baffles me, and trying to postulate as to the chain of events that led Joshua Maddux to become trapped in that chimney taxes my brain profusely. The first scenario would be Josh voluntarily entered the chimney, but one has to ask themselves why. If he was simply being a curious 18-year-old, how could he have forced himself into the chimney to the point that his legs became disjointed from his torso? I don't feel like that's something a person in a rational state of mind is capable of. If his rationale was affected by exposure to the elements, the question still remains, why did he not simply return home when he was in duress? That leaves the avenue open to speculation that he was not in that cabin by his own free will. I do not believe Andrew Newman is involved in this case, as there is no proof he was in Woodland Park other than hearsay, but I must clarify this does not mean that I am discounting it as a human-to-human crime. The evidence as it stands seems to point to the notion that Josh was abducted by one or more assailants and forced into that chimney. But I have to wonder, if such is the case, how was absolutely no evidence left to suggest a crime, and what would have been the motive? I have to say that I am not partial to the notion that he succumbed to hypothermia, as the chain of events for that just does not make sense. You would have to believe that he was hypothermic enough to shed most of his clothes before entering the chimney, and I reiterate, if he was in such danger and able to go home on his own, why did he stay at the cabin? As much as I do not like to postulate on this, one cannot help but feel as though the fact that he was missing so much clothing does steer the mind towards a sexual assault. But again, it does not seem as though any of the evidence found supports that notion. If it was indeed a case of sexual assault and the boy was murdered and hidden in the chimney to cover it up, how did the assailant kill him? There was no evidence of any physical trauma to the body, nothing that would indicate Josh was bound, or indeed nothing to indicate what caused his death. I can certainly say that I understand why many people feel as though the authorities were perhaps espoused to more information than what was officially released, as there is so much about this case that simply does not make sense. I wonder if you have been left with the same feelings of confusion and frustration as I have after learning about the details of this event. It seems as though the path through studying these events continues to run in a circle, and I cannot come to any conclusion that really makes sense. I can say that I do not feel like this was an accidental death caused by actions performed by Josh of his own free will. But the scene of this event is long gone, and all the evidence left cannot help to tell us who put him in that chimney, how they did it, or indeed why. Now you can understand why I stated this case straddles the line between true crime and the paranormal. I will not go out on a limb and postulate any conclusion of such an origin, but I will say that it certainly appears as though he was put in that chimney by some means that are perhaps beyond our understanding. And with that, the mystery of the unexplained death of Joshua Maddux persists. Perhaps one day more evidence will come to light, but being about 8 years on, it seems like the case will remain viewed as merely an accident by authorities. Thank you for joining us for tonight's episode of The Mystery Report. If you enjoyed this broadcast, it would help us tremendously if you could give us a like or a positive review. And most importantly, share us with anyone you know who has a taste for the mysterious. This podcast is available on YouTube as well as Spotify, and I have left links in our show notes to all applicable social media. I encourage you to follow us in order to stay up to date on our posting schedule. If you would like to suggest topics for future episodes or share an unexplained or mysterious event that may be featured on an episode, please utilize our social media. So tune in next time to The Mystery Report. This has been your host, Chance, and I'm signing off.